Was it really the Star of Bethlehem? Was the Normans' invasion of England guided by it? Was it embroidered into the famed Bayeux tapestry from the 11th century? Did it predict death? Was it pure evil? Halley's Comet, perhaps not the most extravagant of the comets, but likely the most famous of them all. I wanted to explore what the advent of the comet would have been like for people in 1910. No internet, no social media, no television, no national radio broadcasts just yet. Just the telegraph and newspapers and word of mouth to find out what was happening in the world. First, let's get to basics. What is a comet? Comets are large objects made of dust and ice that orbit the sun. What are the parts of the comet? At the heart is a solid frozen core called the nucleus, usually less than 10 miles across. When a comet gets close to the sun, it starts to get hot and that ice turns to gas. This action can cause jets of gas to burst out of the comet, bringing dust with it. That creates a fuzzy cloud around the nucleus called a coma. Why do comets have tails? As the aforementioned dust and gas stream away from the nucleus, sunlight and sun particles push them into a tail that stretches behind the comet for millions of miles. And on observation, astronomers can actually see that each comet has two tails, one that is white and made of dust, aka the dust tail, and one that is bluish and is made of electrically charged gas molecules, aka the ion tail. What brings comets near Earth? A planet's or a star's gravitational pull can pull comets out of their home and tug them towards the sun. The path towards the sun can be oval-shaped. It gets pulled to the sun at a fast pace, then whips around behind the sun and heads back home. Some comets may go right into the sun and are lost forever, but sometimes when the path takes it near Earth, we may be able to view it. So what about Halley's Comet specifically? It moves backward around the sun with a tilt of about 18 degrees to that of the Earth's orbit. Halley's motion, in reference to its backward or retrograde motion, is unusual among short-period comets. How far is it away from the sun at its furthest, or aphelion? Just beyond the orbit of Neptune. So normally comets, those nearing the size of Halley's, lose about 3 to 10 feet of their surface as it orbits the sun. This over time causes the comet to appear more dim. As it continues to age, its tails will disappear and the comet finally evolves into simply rocky material, or it becomes dust. An average comet like this can complete about 1,000 trips around the sun before it starts to show its age. Halley has been in its present orbit for at least 16,000 years, and it will still appears to be a spring chicken. Who was this particular comet named after? Edmund Halley was the son of a soap maker, born in London 1656. He loved math and became an astronomical authority. On the island of St. Helena, he applied himself to create a catalog of the stars in the southern hemisphere. He had first observed his comet in Paris in 1680. In 1705, he published Synopsis of Cometary Astronomy. In that, he had recorded 24 comet orbits and became struck with the resemblance between the cometary orbits of those observed in 1531, 1607, and 1682. See where I'm going with this? He was noting the like time intervals between these particular comets, plus a fourth comet that was observed in 1456. And there were records of comets from 1380 and in 1305. Wait, we're jumping ahead. He knew by the observations made that those first four comets, 1456, 1531, 1607, 1682, had to likely be the same comet, reappearing about every 75 to 76 years. He then came to the conclusion that the next comet would appear in 1758. He knew that the inability to very accurately predict the next comet would be because of other planets' gravitational pulls interfering with the comet's orbit and changing the time it would next reappear. Shortly before his death at the age of 85 in 1742, Halley said, quote, "Wherefore, if, according to what we have already said, it should return again about the year 1758, candid posterity will not refuse to acknowledge that this was first discovered by an Englishman." And lo and behold, Halley was right. Here comes the comet in 1758, well after he had passed away. Prior to Halley, other scientists certainly had been observing comets and recorded their observations. Johannes Kepler in 1607 believed that comets moved in straight lines and when passing the Earth would disappear into space. Because he thought they just disappeared forever, he did not consider that they had actual paths that could bring them back in view of Earth. Prior to Kepler, Jerome Fracastor and Peter Appian had already made the observation that a comet's tail always pointed away from the sun, no matter how it traveled. And Kepler later agreed with this and wrote Treatise on Comets. He also observed that there were a lot of comets. Quote, "There are as many arguments to prove the motion of the Earth around the sun as there are comets in the heavens." In 1681, Dorfel of Saxony proved that the orbits of comets are either oval-shaped or parabolic-shaped, and that the sun is the focus of the curve. Sir Isaac Newton also came to this conclusion independently a few years later, and it became established as universal law. Basically, the 1600s were a hotbed of scientific observations of comets, all kinds of comets. Was Edmund Halley the first to officially observe it? No. According to some, it was first observed and recorded by Chinese astronomers around 239 BCE. Obviously, it wasn't named Halley's Comet then. It was named after Halley when he discovered the time intervals between the appearances of the comet. Halley and its buddies are they evil? June 1456, the historians of this time state that the comet seen was large and terrible. Brilliant golden color appeared to be an undulating flame. The Pope at the time, Calixtus III, urged his followers to repeat the Angelus with increased fervor. 1528, Ambrose Pare, father of French surgery, said, quote, "This comet was so horrible, so frightful, and it produced such great terror in the vulgar that some died of fear and others fell sick. It appeared to be of excessive length and was of the color of blood. At the summit of it was seen the figure of a bent arm, holding in its hand a great sword as if about to strike. At the end of the point there were 3 stars. On both sides of the rays of this comet were seen a great number of axes, knives, blood-colored swords, among which were a great number of hideous human faces, beards, and bristling hair." Amazing that he could say all that without the benefit of anything but just his old eyeballs. A comet was generally seen as a divine omen to announce an event that was grand, not necessarily in a good way, or to bring about evil, like war. The death of kings and queens were believed to have been actually announced by the appearance of comets. They were sometimes seen as a cause of misfortune, not just a heralder of it. For example, a comet, not necessarily Halley's, in 43 BC was thought to be the soul of Caesar heading on the superhighway to heaven. Destruction of Jerusalem in 69 AD. Allegedly a comet that was sword-shaped and hovered over the city for a year. Natural History by Pliny, where he wrote, quote, "A comet is ordinarily a very fearful star. It announces no small effusion of blood. We have seen an example of this during the civil commotions of Octavius." End quote. 79 AD, Vespasian, a Roman emperor, would not be intimidated by the star/comet for an interesting reason. Quote, "This hairy star does not concern me. It menaces, rather, the king of the Parthians, for he is hairy and I am bald." End quote. I don't remember learning this kind of reasoning in my philosophy class, and unfortunately for Vespasian, it wasn't long after the appearance of the comet that he died. William Whiston, theologian, astronomer, and friend of Newton, said, quote, "When man has sent a little comet passed very near the earth, and, cutting the course of its orbit obliquely, imparted to it a rotary motion. God had foreseen that man would seen, and that his crimes arrived at their height would call for a terrible punishment. In consequence, he had prepared, at the very instant of creation, a comet, which was to be the instrument of his vengeance." End quote. He's talking about Noah and the flood. So he also predicted that we'd all burn up. Quote, "The earth will be carried away near the sun. It will there experience heat of an extreme intensity. It will get into a state of combustion. Finally, after the saints have reigned 1,000 years over an earth thus regenerated by fire and rendered more habitable by divine will, a last comet will come and strike the earth. The terrestrial orbit will lengthen excessively, and the earth, turned comet again, will cease to be inhabitable." Well then, why the heck should I continue dieting? But there were those who refuted the evilness of a comet. The Reverend Dr. F.P.F. Duffy said, quote, "It is inconceivable that God should select as harbinger of the incarnation a phenomenon that was regarded by mankind as the messenger of disaster. It is too absurd to suppose that the evangelist would be directed to select a sign of every evil portent as the symbol of divine love and the birth of the Messiah. And yes, it's actually thought that Halley's Comet was the Star of Bethlehem. Let's hear more comet love." From Le Figaro by Camille Flammarion. Quote, "Of all the stars, comets are surely those whose appearance arouses the interest of mortals most intensely. Their rarity, their singularity, their mysterious aspect amaze the mind of the most indifferent." End quote. Now it's 1910, and Halley's Comet was due to come a-callin'. It was discovered first when it was still 300 million miles away by astronomer and professor Max Wolf of Heidelberg on September 11, 1909. He notified the Harvard Observatory. When it was between the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, it was moving at 520 miles a minute. Passing Jupiter, 783 miles a minute. Around the Sun zone, double that. As the larger observatories were finally able to see the comet over the next month, it was noted that the comet's tail was missing. Questions and so much speculation were raised about the comet in its early days of observation, prior to its nearest point arrival in May 1910. Though scientists assured the public that the comet would be tens of millions of miles away from the Earth at its closest, still some remembered the Bayeux comet of 1885, which split into two, parts of which fell into Mexico. I do plan to do a story about this in the future. Speculation as to whether or not Halley's could suffer a similar fate, and if it did, what would become of the comet and of the Earth? Another question, whether or not the comet's tail was back fully as it was in ancient times. One French observatory director thought that X-rays may shoot on us and condense more water vapor than has been seen since the deluge. This has to do with floods in Paris around this time. Another French observatory director says that just because we went through the tail of another particular comet unscathed does not mean we will go through this one without issue. Because the comet changes volume and mass during its long journeys, it's hard to pinpoint. Some people say that, quote, "they will give us a bad scare of electrical nerve twisting in the midst of terrific bombardments of meteoric matter and lights never known on Earth or sea," end quote. Others say general feeling of seasickness from electromagnetic conditions. Some say poison atmosphere from cyanogen gas because of the discovery of this gas in a previous comet. Others state that we'll have to go into our cellars to hide against vortices of tiny stones and metal particles. The other side of the Earth will see nothing. But what's not being mentioned is that the Earth and comet are not on the same plane of existence. We already know that the comet can become affected by gravitational pulls from other planets, like Jupiter and Saturn, for example. Then there appeared to be a fear that the Earth would pass through the tail of the comet. Professor John N. Stockwell in the Tacoma Times said, quote, "The comet will actually pass over the sun's disk at local noon in eastern Asia and Australia," end quote, meaning pass between the Earth and the sun. At that point, it's 14 million miles away. At that time, the Earth will pass through the comet's tail with a relative velocity of 45 miles per second. If the tail is 1 million miles wide, the Earth would be about 6 hours passing through it. The question, what is the effect of passing through its tail? It appears that there was some uncertainty as to what the tails consisted of. Professor Stockwell states, quote, "The most recent explanation of the nature of comets' tails supposes them to be composed of particles of matter smaller than propulsion of flight. If it's correct, it certainly relieves us from all danger of physical violence arising. The Earth's atmosphere will serve as a buffer and prevent the rapid fall of the cometary matter which would otherwise take place," end quote. And by the way, the article title, quote, "The comet will not harm us," end quote. Some thinking passing through the tail will be like seeing electric light in the darkness, but basically they do not anticipate any harm to the Earth thanks to the Earth's atmosphere. But it was hard for the general public to get a handle on any potential dangers, as astronomers at this point were still not completely sure what the comet's tail was made of. May 18th, 1910, the day of the comet. And in post-comet news, Daily Arizona Silver Belt newspaper said, quote, "The comet came. The comet went. And this old Earth is no worse and no better, and thus far very little wiser." End quote. Apparently, all of the fears of the Earth passing through the comet's tail were all for naught. The Earth did pass through the tail, and no one suffered from any deadly gases because of it. What actually caused some interest that day was not the comet, but sunspots that were observed at around the same time from 5 observatories located in the west. Of course, it was just a coincidence. One did not cause the other. Observers could not accurately say when the Earth passed through the tail, but most seemed to average around 7 and 8 at night Pacific time. The width or breadth of the tail was said to be 1,000,000 miles. But hey, what about those sunspots? Well, that's not what this presentation is about, but here's a bit of info. Carnegie Observatory Director George E. Hale and his team found a large group of sunspots around the center of the sun, then a smaller group seeming to be part of the larger group, and then a single spot on the edge of the sun. The total length of the largest group was about 100,000 miles. Apparently these were spotted and photographed on May 14th, and since then, spots have greatly enlarged. Apparently there had been some earthquakes recently, and Director Hale assured the public that the sunspots would have had nothing to do with those, nor with the comet, except maybe to make the comet brighter. Quote, "Eruptions associated with large spots like those we now have on the sun are supposed to send out electrons. If these pass through the comet, they might increase its brightness perceptibly." So what was the deal with the tail after all? Harold Jacoby, Rutherford Professor of Astronomy at Columbia University, regarding tail oddities, said, quote, "The fact that the comet's tail was not visible at the time of its contact with the Earth must be regarded as a vindication for the general belief of astronomers that the tail is so thin that its presence is undetectable. It seems that there is a little change in the comet's appearance when comparing this past to prints from 1835. And that brings up an interesting question. If the comet is shedding its core out into that filmy veil all the way through its journey, it's hard to figure out how it has lasted as long as it has. Never materially more inspiring than the present. It is quite probable comets grow tails only within this particular solar system. When we first located them, they are only a blur. Then the tails begin to grow, increasing constantly as the sun is approached. Maybe then, the sun makes the tail by making the comet's head boil with its heat, or driving the particles off by friction of its rays." End quote. From the city of Berlin, there were no perceptible changes in the Earth's atmosphere according to eminent German astronomers and scientists who witnessed the Earth's passage through the comet's tail while riding in balloons. The higher altitude would help provide better study. They saw nothing, noted no air changes, bottled air samples taken at all levels, no difference as to what is normal for the Earth. No traces of cyanogen gas. Contradictions. So, oddly, this paper reported that the Earth did not even pass through the comet's tail, but then later said it did, but much later than originally thought. Apparently, some astronomers, because of the angle that they had been looking at the tail previously, had missed the curve that had developed in the tail as it approached. The comet's tail was appearing in the east when some astronomers had said it would be in the west. Apparently, most predictions regarding the head, aka the nucleus, of the comet were spot on. Quote, "But the mystery of the appearance of the tail in the east this morning is a great puzzle. It cannot be explained satisfactorily at this time." From Professor Frost. The newspaper provided accounts from several observatories who were each stating that either the Earth had not gone through the comet's tail at all, would go through the comet's tail later, or had already gone through the tail earlier. Grasping for any sort of interesting comet phenomena, one director from a local weather bureau said that the stars appeared to twinkle with unusual brightness, but that may have been because of the recent rain. He couldn't say for sure. Some locals said that there appeared to be a haze to the sky, but local weather experts said this couldn't have been because of the comet. And ending our journey into 1910 Halley's Comet, quote, "Last time this astronomical wonder came, we knew nothing of airships and many of the modern inventions. Note the advance in civilizations today. What will be going on here when Halley's Comet comes here in 1985? Will this nation and the present nations be as they are now? We do not know. One thing sure, we will not see this comet again. Only those who follow us will behold the next return of Halley's Comet." So I bet you're thinking, hey, you're talking about 1910, but I can do math. We would have had one in about 1985 or 86, right? Yes. 1986, astronomers were able to view the comet from the Palomar Observatory when the comet was still well past Saturn. When it was closer, spacecraft did a maverick flyby of the comet in order to better see it, to see if we could finally figure out what it was made from. It appeared, according to the European Space Agency spacecraft, to be a dark potato-shaped object 9 miles by 5 miles. The nucleus looked to be a mixture of water and other volatile ices, silicate, and carbon-rich dust. About 70% of the surface was covered by a very dark type of crust. The other 30% was active and was producing bright jets of gas and dust. The dark crust helped to explain the high temperature, which was balmy 188 degrees Fahrenheit. The nucleus was a solid body which had been previously proposed by Fred Whipple in 1950, who likened the comet to a dirty snowball. When will we hopefully see it next? It will return to the inner solar system at perihelion, when it's closest to the sun, on July 27, 2061. For those of us around at that time, it will be interesting to see the differences in hearing about it and observing it in 2061 versus 1985 versus 1910, etc., etc. Long live Halley's Comet!